Hi there. If you watch this video when we recorded it live, you might be wondering why we're releasing another one. And I gotta say, that's a pretty valid question to ask. The first video we did had multiple audio and video issues, so we decided to make that one private and re release a pre recorded video. So that's what you're watching right now. And as a bonus, we are releasing the video at a time when you're awake. When most of you are awake. There's people, I guess, that live in like this mythical place called Australia. Anyways, yeah, I guess they'll wake up or something at some point and watch this. Hi, Navardia and other people that live there. Uh, we didn't do a show yesterday because we were a bit busy. And we weren't going to do anything today or anytime other this week either. Not because you folks aren't awesome or because there isn't any news that we'd like to share with you, because there's a lot. Apparently, the Pope had colon surgery. But then I came across this article in something called The American Conservative. And I've got to say, fuck you, American Conservative. Actually, no, I'm not going to go through the entirety of our awesome theme song thing. Intro, theme, intro theme song intro themery. Anyways, whatever. I'm too pissed to watch all of that. And if I don't get to watch that and get the sincere joy out of that, nobody gets to. So, there's other videos. Go watch those. Where were we? Right. Okay. The American Conservative. What the fuck is the American Conservative? Well, I'm glad you asked because I asked as well. The American Conservative boasts itself as Main Street conservatives, small town, rural business, small business supporters who tend to favor the ideals of the farmers rather than the bankers. Now, whether or not that's what they actually believe is up for debate. They claim that their principles rest on the beliefs that America is a republic, true, not an empire, false, and that an advanced military is vital to protect the interests of the country because we're so in danger of being fucking invaded. Strong families and local communities, quote, are the foundation of a free and virtuous society. And the rejection of of the idea of crony capitalism is key, and that apparently religious freedom is of the utmost importance and political correctness should be completely abandoned, much like the hope of all ye who enter here. Now, they also make it very clear that the website and its writers are promoting American interests, whatever the fuck that means, and they totally don't hold to the conservative archetype that you're currently thinking of. They're about constitutional conservatism, with things like localism and a strong middle class taking precedence over foreign wars where American interests aren't at stake. And yet, military, whatever, I don't know. This is what they say, what winning the conservatism of tomorrow looks like. Guns and stuff. Unsurprisingly, TAC's their advisory board, consists of winners like famed white supremacist Tucker Carlson. Pause for emphasis on the three Ks in his first name. Strange that nobody actually ever notices that, but it explains so much. Tim Carney, who is the author of the book Obamonomics: How Barack Obama is Bankrupting You and Enriching His Wall Street Friends, Corporate Lobbyists, and Union Bosses. Side note, that's a really long title and subtitle. Break it down. Just say you're fucking racist. And Rachel Bovard, Bovard, Bouvard, I don't know, who has served in varying roles of both houses of Congress, including legislative director for Rand Paul, noted conservative, and legislative assistant to both Donald Manzullo from Illinois and Ted Poe from Texas. And no, we're not joking, that's actually his name. And that's just a couple of the people that she's worked with. The writers boast even less of a sense of diversity. Senior editor Rod Dreher has, according to Wikipedia, written extensively on the Benedict opinion or Benedict option, which espouses that Christians should isolate themselves from post Obergefell society in order to keep their faith intact due to people falling away from the traditional ideas surrounding marriage, sex, and gender. K. Magazine editor Helen Andrews has a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from Yale. Impressive, and has written extensively on how unsettling change in the Catholic Church has become and how awful it is that the country is becoming less religious, apparently in practice. Sean Riley, TAC's Associate Director of Programs and Development, holds a PhD in political theory from the Catholic University of America, promise that's actually really a thing, and wrote a very supportive review of R.R. Reno's Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, in which he quotes T.S. Eliot. If you will not have God, and he is a jealous God, you should pay your respects to Hitler or Stalin. Strange they didn't mention Mao. So they're all conservative Christians, and they're all white. Because, of course, they're all white. And that's not counting the next person, yeah, that we're going to talk about, who is, as it turns out, also white. Declan Leary. Susan already wants to punch him for his article on Jason Isbell that bitches about alt country, and she'll tell you all about that in a different video, I guess. But I'm gonna digress. Moving on to this other stuff about him. Leary is a staunch conservative Catholic who has literally said, and I'm not fucking kidding, thank God in heaven for Donald J. Trump. He's a vehement denier of the legitimacy of Biden's presidency, called the January 6th insurrection the Catholic debacle. I'm sorry, the Capitol debacle. Catholic capital. I mean, come on. You don't like Catholics in the Capitol, anyways. And says that, quote, people who complain about sitcom husbands just hate men and America and you, by the way. And I'm not sure he's being hyperbolic with his opinions of any of these things. He also unironically calls Trump the Donald and dead names or misgenders Caitlyn Jenner, who probably aligns with Larry politically in more ways than he'd care to admit, which I bet he would not like to admit that. Anyways, long story short, Declan Leary is a gigantic piece of shit. And that was before we read what he wrote. Because holy fuck, what the fuck is this? Just fuckity. Side note, real quick. Do we get demonetized if we say fuck too many times? No? Oh, we aren't monetized to begin with. Never mind. Joke's on you, censorers. Anyways, fuck you. Back to Declan. Earlier today, I was perusing Twitter, something I am wont to do, and I came across a link from an article in something called The American Conservative, a publication or blog or something I had never heard of before and kind of wish I hadn't even now. And the title of the article that I was linked to is The Meaning of the Native Graves. Subtitle, They're Good, Actually. I was going to have one of those pause for effect moments here, but I really don't need to or want to. Period. Have you ever heard the phrase, never judge a book by its cover? Because it's usually a pretty good idea, right? The best book ever written, Watership Down, isn't about a ship filled with water which went down. To Kill a Mockingbird has nothing to do with getting rid of the birds which mock. Catcher in the Rye, which, okay, I just realized there's apparently a the at the front of that. I don't know, isn't about, look, you get it. Sometimes book titles are a bit misleading, okay? Especially Watership Down. But anyways, but this article, you should definitely judge it by its cover. And you're likely to be correct. Do you think it might be about defending genocide? Ding, ding, ding. Whitewashing history? Also correct. Go you. excusing Catholicism and how the Catholic Church, with the help of the Canadian government, did a genocide? All of the above. Yes. And it isn't even the fucking beginning of it. And yet, link in the description or whatever, but do yourself the favor of not giving this white supremacist Catholic national, like, fuck the clicks. Because I read it anyways. The article begins with a passage from the Bible, because of course it does, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 51 to 62, in which Jesus tells people to give up everything and follow him right then, because the God was about to return and set up his kingdom, in which the 12 disciples, including Judas, would rule over the 12 tribes of Judah, and Jesus would rule over them as the King of the Kings. Strange he would tell Judas if he's about to betray him or whatever, but I mean, what do I know? I'm not God. Jesus says this to a man who wants to bury his father. He wants to follow him, but the guy wants to follow Jesus, but wants to bury his father first. And he said, "Let the dead bury their dead, but go thou and preach the kingdom of God." All right. So Leary, then, if you're wondering why that at all is a lead in to any kind of an article, this is why. He then tells the story of a French Jesuit missionary named Jean de Brebeuf, who came to Canada in the 1600s with, as Leary puts it, the singular mission of making these people, the Huron natives, Catholic. Never mind that their own religious beliefs or their way of life, Brebeuf wanted only to tell them how they would all go to hell if they didn't believe like he did. And by the way, how, like, before the whole sword thing and shooting people that didn't, how did this ever work, like, to begin with? Like, was it always like the fear tactic, like, believe like I'm going to, or you're going to go to hell? Especially to the people who were like polytheists in Greek culture and stuff. How exactly did that work? You know what? I'm sidetracked. Anyways, Brebeuf converted some Huron to Catholicism before in 1649. They were attacked by members of an Iroquois tribe. Brebeuf was tortured and executed, and, quote, the natives consumed Father Brebeuf's blood and heart, which, by the way, is a true story. They did that because they admired his courage. He mentions how the other colonizers burned the Catholic Church to the ground before leaving. Now, why mention this? Because he leads into, quote, it would not be the last church burned in the land whose heavenly patron is now Saint Jean de Brebeuf. In recent weeks, 9 Canadian churches, both Catholic and Anglican, have been subjected to arson attacks. But why are these innocent churches being burnt? Now, I suppose churches are actually innocent. They're buildings and can't do anything wrong, but I'm getting super off track. Why are they being burnt? According to Declan, the popular narrative, broadcast by an astonishingly credulous media, is that previously unknown mass graves of children were discovered just this summer on the grounds of Indian residential schools, and in a rash of grief and righteous anger, indigenous protesters swept across the nation, desecrating churches. All right, well, that kind of tracks. Mass graves would make me mad too. But then he follows it up with this. It is very important to note that the entire story is made up. First, we have always known that many children died in the residential schools, which were active through the 19th and 20th centuries. Child mortality was relatively high during the period to begin with. Indian mortality overall was astronomically high, and the church run schools for Native children were systemically underfunded by the government, resulting in subpar facilities and inadequate medical care. Second, the sites almost certainly include the graves of Christian adults from the neighboring communities, as Chief Cadmus Delorme of the Cowessist First Nation admitted with respect to the Marival Indian Residential School, where an estimated 751 burials were detected by radar last month. The mass graves, he puts this in quotes by himself, of public hysteria are, in fact, the ordered and intentional burial sites of people we already knew were dead and who died of more or less natural causes. In more literate times, we might have called that a cemetery. I just caught like the 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 insult there with the more literate times. Anyways, Declan, you don't get to do that, you sick fuck. You don't get to say, we always knew this was going on and that makes it okay. And it's totally put there to see that marked graves, not mass graves, and that this was all made up be, because because it it's not made up. As Ian Austin and Dan Bilevsky noted in the New York Times, for decades, the indigenous children were taken from their families, sometimes by force, and housed in crowded, church run boarding schools where they were abused and prohibited from speaking their languages. Thousands vanished altogether. They were taken from their families by force, abused and prohibited from speaking their own languages. Thousands of them vanished altogether. I'm 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 sorry, but this doesn't seem like this something that was made up, especially when First Nations peoples who survived the forced schooling had already been speaking about it. It's unclear how the children died at the schools, which were buffeted by disease outbreaks a century ago, and where children faced sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and violence. Some former students of the schools have described the bodies of infants born to girls impregnated by priests and monks being incinerated. Brothers and sisters were prohibited from seeing each other, and the government and churches even arranged marriages for those who happened to survive and graduate. And I'm certain, by the way, that these children had a say in the matter, right? No, no, they didn't. They didn't have a say in. Oh, okay. Well, okay, cool. Public Works Minister Hector Langevin said this to the Canadian Parliament in 1883. If you wish to educate these children, you must separate them from their parents during the time that they are being educated. If you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they will remain savages. Whereas by separating them in the way proposed, they acquire the habits and tastes. It is to be hoped only the good tastes of civilized people. So, you know, if you want the children to be civilized, they had to be forcibly removed from their parents and educated. Only the good tastes. Sexual, physical, and emotional abuse across the board, incinerated infants born of girls, children who had been raped by priests who they were forced to stay with and could be forced, they could be, if they escaped, they could be captured via a governmental warrant and returned, where they would face even more abuse. But but you have more, right, Declan? This wasn't the end of your post, right? You have more, right? Okay, cool. We got. This is not to discount the deaths of children altogether. Well, I'm glad we got that out of the way. We're not going to completely discount the deaths of children who were brutalized by the Catholic Church. Not completely. That would be heartless, especially when this entire story was apparently made up, says Declan. Well, if we're not going to completely discount the deaths of children, where exactly, Declan, pray tell, should we place the blame? Though this is what Declan says. But it is absolutely to discount the blame fixed on the church by the vicious opportunists. If anyone is at fault here, and the residential school system, for all the good of its evangelizing purpose, was hardly without flaws, it is, without a doubt, the secular authority. Had the Canadian government, which in word endorsed the Christian mission of the residential schools, upheld that word in deed by providing the funding which church authorities repeatedly said was necessary for adequate operation, living conditions could have been improved and a great many premature deaths avoided. But this failure of the secular authority to sufficiently serve the church does not in any way indict that Christian mission. And make no mistake, the residential schools were first and foremost Christian, which he's not wrong about that. They were. But but got it. It isn't the fault of the priests who forcefully removed First Nations children from their families, forced them to live in boarding schools they didn't know or they didn't have adequate supplies, that abused the children, forbade them from speaking their own language, and incinerated infants. It's the fault of the secular society, and without a doubt, apparently, and that's just the secular authority. It's the secular authority's fault. It's the government's fault. Now, I should note that the Canadian government is absolutely culpable, just like the American government with regard to the genocide of First Nations peoples. But check out what Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, said to the House of Commons in 1883. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence, and the only way to do that was to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men. He said that. So, no, Canadian government, you are not off the hook. You did a bad, and you continue to do a bad. But to put the blame solely on the government when it was the Catholic priests who were abusing and murdering those put in their care? I don't think so. And the Catholic Church has actually even admitted to this. The Pope has, I don't know, kind of apologized, with Archbishop Dan Bolin saying, "The incredible burden of the past is still with us, and the truth of that past needs to come out, however painful. We pledge to do what we can to turn that apology into meaningful, concrete acts." So, I mean, kind of an apology, I guess. But what about Tom Cavanaugh? No relation to SCOTUS beer Kavanaugh in the United States. I mean, I don't think so. At least maybe district supervisor of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate for British Columbia and the Yukon, who at a Truth and Reconciliation Commission meeting in 2012 said this of his time as a supervisor at the Christie Residential School. That's the Truth and Reconciliation. He said, "What I experienced over the 6 years I was at Christie's Residential School was a staff, native and non native alike, working together to provide, as much as possible, a safe, loving environment for the children attending Christie School. Was it a perfect situation? No, it wasn't a perfect situation. But again, there didn't seem to be any at that time. At that time, any other viable alternative in providing a good education for so many children who lived in relatively small and isolated communities." Seems great, right? Right? Seems 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 like that was this is an optimal thing. I mean, it wasn't 100% great, but seems like it's optimal. Except maybe it wasn't so great because the survivors of his school and others who were in attendance demanded accountability, saying, "Truth, tell the truth." So then he decided to acknowledge a bit more. He said, "I can honestly say that our men are hurting too because of the abuse scandal and the rift that this has created between First Nations and church representatives. Many of our men who are still working with the First Nations have attended various truth and reconciliation sessions as well as returning to spirit sessions, hoping to bring about healing for all concerned. The Oblates desire healing for the abused and for all touched by the past breach of trust. It is our hope that together we can continue to build a better society. Well, would you look at that? It's almost like the Catholic Church is kind of culpable for stuff that happened at their schools. Now, as a side note, just a little bit of an aside here, why couldn't they build better schools? Was it because they forced the children to do the labor? Because that kind of seems like maybe that's something they shouldn't have done. Sure, blame the government for not sending you enough money, but if you're going to follow Jesus, why not be better carpenters? I digress. But I think that there's actually more to this. Ina Seicher, who had survived Christie, was attending that same conference and had, how should we say, a bit of a different story to tell. She says, I went to Christie Residential School. This morning I heard a priest talking about his Christie Residential School. I want to tell him about my Christie Residential School. I went there for 10 months. 10 months that impacted my life for 50 years. I am just now on my healing journey. I need to do this. I need to speak out. I need to speak for my mom and dad who went to residential school, for my aunts, my uncles, and all that are beyond now. All the pain of our people, the hurt, the anger. That priest that talked about how loving that Christie residential school was, it was not. That priest was most likely in his office not knowing what was going on in the dorms or in the lunchroom. There were things that happened at Christie Residential School, and like I said, I'm just starting my healing journey. There are doors I don't even want to open. I don't even want to open those doors because I don't know what it would do to me. Well, that sounds a little bit different, doesn't it? Like, maybe the Catholic Church isn't doing a great job at telling the truth. Fucking shocker. Oh, and did I mention that she's a survivor? She's still alive because the schools weren't shut down until 19 fucking 98. Were they still underfunded in 1998? Declan? And to blame the government for the buildings when in 1904 Indian Commissioner David Laird said the schools seemed, quote, to have been selected without proper regard for either water supply or drainage. I need not mention any school in particular, but I have urged improvements in several cases in regard to fire protection. So, did the government make all the Catholic folks build all their houses on the sand instead of on a rock? And by the way, it wasn't like the government didn't try to help. In 1909, Dr. Peter Bryce, Indian Affairs Chief Medical Officer, begged, literally begged, the government to give him control of the schools because of the responses he had received to a questionnaire he had given to 15 schools regarding the deaths of students. Here are their responses. Of a total of 1,537 pupils reported, upon nearly 25% are dead. Of one school with an absolutely accurate statement, 69% of ex pupils are dead. And that everywhere, the almost invariable cause of death given is tuberculosis. He drew particular attention to the fate of the 31 students who had been discharged from the File Hills School. 9 were in good health, 22 dead. He was denied this administrative oversight. Why? Because the Catholic Church opposed it. Declan goes on and says, likewise, the certain fact that souls were saved by the missionaries, the enduring belief of Christians that the gospel is true and must be spread, is paramount. Everything else is secondary. I'm sorry, what? Everything else is secondary? The fact that thousands of First Nations children were tossed in mass graves is secondary, that many were abused, that infants of children who were raped by priests were incinerated is secondary. Secondary to what exactly? You sick fuck. You're not done yet. Well, please go on with your hate speech, your defense of genocide. Go ahead. Whatever good was present at the ossuary, this is Declan writing, where those had not yet encountered the fullness of truth, honored their dead as best they knew how, is increased a thousandfold in the cemeteries of the residential schools, where baptized Christians were given Christian burials. Whatever natural good was present in the piety and the community of the pagan past is an infinitesimal fraction of the grace rendered upon those pagans' descendants who have been received into the Church of Christ. Whatever sacrifices were exacted in pursuit of that grace, the suffocation of a noble pagan culture, an increase in disease and bodily death due to government negligence, even the sundering of natural families, is worth it. I'm going to read this again because it needs to be said again. Whatever good was present, where those who had not yet encountered the fullness of truth honored their dead as best they knew how, is increased a thousandfold in the cemeteries and the residential schools where baptized Christians were given Christian burials. Whatever natural good was present in the piety and the community of the pagan past is an infinitesimal fraction of the grace rendered upon those or unto those pagans' descendants who have been received into the Church of Christ. Whatever sacrifices were exacted in pursuit of that grace, the suffocation of a noble pagan culture, an increase in disease and bodily death due to government negligence, even the sundering of natural families, is worth it, is what Declan says. All of that is worth it. And I'm sorry, cemeteries, Christian burials, way to whitewash what was discovered and is still being discovered. Mass graves, created by the Catholics and other Christian denominations as well, but we're talking about the Catholics again, just justifying genocide as we're doing right now. And wow, nobody ever remind Declan how the Catholics had rat lines, which they used to help the Nazis escape Europe after World War II. Whatever, I'm certain the Catholics are fine. Yeah, they'll be good and stuff. And the Nazis are definitely good people or whatever on both sides. I don't really know. This guy asked the Donald, I guess. And was it worth it to snuff out what he calls a noble pagan culture? That's called committing genocide by infecting First Nations people with diseases and tearing families apart. It was worth it? Worth it is the words you used. These are the lives of people, lives of children, families. This isn't some noble cause you're speaking about. This is about the abuse of children at the hands of those who you cannot help but defend. You demented. Was the Holocaust worth it? Nazis would say yes. Was the genocide of millions of First Nations peoples in what is now the United States worth it? Well, you already said yes to that one, didn't you? This is sick. It is demented, soulless, horrible, etc. You might think that the Washington Post and the New York Times are fake news, but at least they aren't writing genocide defending hate speech.